As Admiral Kimmel stood by the window of his office at the submarine base, his jaw set in stony anguish. As he watched the disaster across the harbor unfold with terrible fury, a spent .50 caliber bullet crashed through the glass. It cut his white jacket and raised a welt on his chest. "You would have been merciful had it killed me," Kimmel murmured. Hello and welcome to Daily History. Today, we will analyze all the events that led to the worst intelligence failure in American history, from the start of worsening relations between Japan and the US until the attack on Pearl Harbor as well as its aftermath. Back in the 1920s, a war between Japan and the US was already considered a possibility. Japan had been wary of American territorial and military expansion in the Pacific and Asia since the late 1890s, followed by the annexation of Hawaii and the Philippines. However, tensions did not seriously grow until Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Over the next decade, Japan expanded into China, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Starting in December of that same year, events such as the Japanese attack on the USS Panay and the Nanking Massacre swung Western public opinion sharply against Japan. In mid-1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii, also ordering a military buildup in the Philippines. The US finally ceased oil exports to Japan in 1941, following the Japanese seizure of French Indochina after the fall of France. On the 17th of August, Roosevelt warned Japan that America was prepared to take opposing steps if neighboring countries were attacked. The Japanese were faced with a dilemma: either withdraw from China or seize new resources of raw materials in the European colonies in Asia. Japan and the US engaged in various negotiations during 1941, attempting to improve relations. After months of talk, Japan's final proposal was delivered on November the 20th, offering to withdraw from southern Indochina and refrain from attacks in Southeast Asia, in exchange for 1 million US gallons of aviation fuel, lifting sanctions and ceasing aid to China. The American counter-proposal of November the 26th required that Japan completely evacuate China without conditions and conclude non-aggression pacts with the Pacific powers. However, on November the 25th, the day before the delivery of the note, seeing no progress in the negotiations, the Japanese task force left the port for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese fleet sent to Pearl Harbor, commanded by Admiral Yamamoto, was composed of 6 aircraft carriers carrying 408 planes, numerous battleships, destroyers, and submarines. The Japanese attack was first intended to destroy important American fleet units, as well as buy time for Japan to consolidate its position and deliver a blow to America's ability to mobilize its forces in the Pacific. After reconnaissance, it was noted that all 3 of the US Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were absent, but Yamamoto decided to press ahead. The attack took place before any formal declaration of war was made by Japan, even though it wasn't Yamamoto's intention, but transcribing the declaration took too long for the Japanese ambassador to deliver it on schedule. As the first wave, composed of 183 planes, approached the island of Oahu, it was detected by the US Army radar near the island's northern tip, but the lieutenant commanding the station presumed it was just the scheduled arrival of 6 B-17 bombers from California. The Japanese air assault began at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. Japanese planes reached Oahu in 2 waves. Slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers led the first wave, exploiting the first moments of surprise to attack the most important ships present. In the first wave, about 8 armor-piercing bombs dropped, hit their intended battleship targets, as well as 13 torpedoes. Men aboard US ships awoke to the sound of alarms, bombs exploding and gunfire, prompting the men to dress as they ran to general quarters stations. The defenders were very unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked, and aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip in the open. The first wave resulted in huge damage, destroying or heavily damaging several ships. The second plane wave consisted of 171 planes, divided into 3 groups, arriving at the attack points almost simultaneously from several directions, aiming at ground targets such as aircraft and hangars. The second wave destroyed hundreds of aircraft that were still parked around the hangars, as well as damaged several ground facilities. 90 minutes after it began, the attack was over. 2,403 Americans were killed, including sailors, soldiers, airmen, marines, and even civilians. 4 battleships were destroyed and 4 more were damaged, as well as numerous cruisers, destroyers, and other ships. According to some accounts, several Japanese officers urged Nagumo, leader of Japan's main carrier battle group, to carry out a third strike, but Nagumo decided to withdraw for several reasons. The day after the attack, Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, calling for a formal declaration of war on the Empire of Japan, to which the Congress obliged. The attack was an initial shock to all the allies in the Pacific theater. Japan attacked the Philippines hours later, as well as the Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. One further consequence of the attack on Pearl Harbor was that Japanese-American residents and citizens were relocated to nearby Japanese-American internment camps. While the attack mostly accomplished its intended objective, it turned out to be a huge mistake from the Japanese High Command. Admiral Harata Daiichi summed up the Japanese result by saying, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." A major flaw of Japanese strategic thinking was a belief that the ultimate Pacific battle would be fought by battleships, resulting in Yamamoto hardening battleships for a decisive battle that never happened. The Japanese confidence in their ability to win a quick victory meant that they neglected Pearl Harbor's naval repair yards, oil tank farms, submarine bases, and so on. The survival of these facilities allowed Pearl Harbor to maintain logistical support for the US Navy's operations, such as the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway. In the following years, US submarines immobilized the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy ships and brought Japan's economy to a standstill. By the end of 1942, the number of raw materials brought was cut in half, while oil was almost completely stopped. The attack on Pearl Harbor is considered to be a major intelligence flaw for the US, since as early as 1924, Chief of the US Air Service Mason Patrick displayed a concern for military vulnerabilities in the Pacific. The decisions of military and political leadership to ignore these warnings have contributed to various conspiracy theories, stating that various parties in the US and British governments knew of the attack. However, these theories are completely rejected by mainstream historians.